If you've searched for dyscalculia online, you've probably come away with more questions than you started with. One source tells you it's about not being able to remember times tables. Another says it's a difficulty with number sense. A third uses language so clinical it's hard to understand what it means for your child in their particular context. And some of what you read seems to contradict other pieces. In this episode, I'll explain why that confusion is understandable. The people writing those articles aren't being careless or making stuff up. They're working from different frameworks, from different countries, and in some cases from different times. You see, researchers, assessors, organisations, and educators have been debating how to define dyscalculia for a long time, and they haven't always agreed. Welcome to Safety in Numbers, a podcast for parents of children who struggle with maths, including those with dyscalculia or a specific learning difficulty in maths. In each episode, we explore what might be happening when maths feels difficult and what parents can do to better understand and support their child. What you're reading online reflects that messiness. It's not a neat, agreed picture, I'm afraid. Part of the reason you'll find different definitions and therefore conflicting advice is that different countries use different frameworks and they don't always carve things up in the same way. For example, in the United States, the main diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, uses the term specific learning disorder with impairment in mathematics. Now, this is a broad category that covers many kinds of maths difficulty. And interestingly, dyscalculia isn't a formal diagnosis in its own right within that system. It's noted in the DSM-5 as an alternative term. The World Health Organization also has its own classification, which lists developmental learning disorder with impairment in mathematics, and includes dyscalculia as a related term, but again without the precision that more recent research has made possible. In England, the framework that shapes how most specialist assessors work is set by SASC. Now, SASC stands for the Specific Learning Difficulties Assessment Standards Committee. And what makes the SASC 2025 guidance distinctive is that it does something the other frameworks don't. It formally distinguishes dyscalculia from other maths difficulties rather than grouping them all together. Not every child who struggles with maths has dyscalculia. And for a child with dyscalculia, the difficulty has a very specific origin. It's about how their brain processes the size and meaning of numbers, which sets it apart from other kinds of maths difficulty. It's a distinction worth understanding, and that is what this episode is all about. Those other frameworks aren't wrong. They serve different purposes in different contexts. But when a parent is searching for answers, landing on all three without knowing they come from different systems is genuinely confusing. There's also the question of time. Our understanding of dyscalculia has been developing rapidly and definitions have shifted. The previous SASC guidance was published in 2019. And in March 2025, SASC published updated guidance drawing on the most recent research into how children develop mathematical understanding and where that development can go differently. That's the definition I'm using, and it's much more precise than much of what still circulates online. Now, it is worth noting that even within the research community, there are ongoing debates. SASC is clear about this in its guidance. The science of maths difficulties is younger than the science of dyslexia, and our understanding is still developing. What the 2025 guidance gives us is the best, most carefully considered picture we currently have. So if you felt confused or felt that nothing you've read quite captured what you're seeing with your child, that's a reasonable response to a genuinely complex picture. So this episode is my attempt to give you something clearer to work with. Before I explain what dyscalculia is, I want to give it some context because one of the most common misunderstandings I encounter is the idea that dyscalculia and having a specific learning difficulty in maths mean the same thing, and they don't. The understanding of the difference is what's important here. The broader category is what SASC calls a specific learning difficulty in maths, often shortened to SpLD in maths. In plain terms, it means that a child finds learning and using maths significantly and persistently harder than you would expect given everything else that you know about them. It refers to specific, identifiable ways that a child's brain handles information. For example, how well they can hold things in their mind while using them, how they process language, how they make sense of visual and spatial information, how quickly they can take on and respond to what's in front of them, how easily they can plan and organize their thinking, keep track of a sequence of steps, and switch their attention from one thing to another. Now, there's a lot there. Any of those or a combination of those can genuinely make maths harder. And they have nothing to do with the amount of effort or the child's intelligence. What makes it a specific learning difficulty rather than an ordinary struggle or a temporary gap is that the difficulty is significant, persistent, and has a real impact on learning and everyday life. It doesn't resolve on its own. It doesn't simply disappear with more practice or a new teacher. Now, a child will make progress with the right support, whether that's targeted intervention at school or help at home. And that progress matters and is worth sustaining. It may be slow or it may feel really small, but if that support is withdrawn, the underlying difficulties are still there. Progress is possible, but it needs the right support behind it consistently over time. Now, dyscalculia sits within this broader picture of SpLD in maths. It isn't a separate thing. It's a specific type of SpLD in maths identified when a particular kind of processing difficulty is at the core of what's getting in the way. And that's what I'd like to explain in this next section. But before I do, I want to say something that the SASC guidance states explicitly and that I think is really important for parents to understand. An SpLD in maths that doesn't involve dyscalculia is not a lesser difficulty. It's not a milder version or something to be less concerned about. SASC refer to it as an equally debilitating difficulty. So that means that it's equally significant, equally impactful, equally deserving of understanding and support as dyscalculia. The distinction between dyscalculia and having an SpLD in maths matters for precision, for understanding what's going on and what will help. It doesn't create a hierarchy. I've worked with children whose maths difficulties had nothing to do with dyscalculia and whose struggles were just as significant, just as frustrating, and just as in need of being properly understood as any child I've assessed who did have dyscalculia. So what is dyscalculia specifically? Within the broader picture of SpLD in maths, dyscalculia is identified when the difficulty is centered on something called numerical magnitude processing. Now, I want to explain what that means because it sounds more technical than it is. Magnitude simply means size or quantity, and numerical magnitude processing is the brain's ability to understand and work with numbers as quantities, to have an automatic, intuitive sense of how big a number is, how it compares to other numbers, and what it actually represents. It's the difference between seeing the number 7 and just knowing without having to think about it that it's bigger than 5 and smaller than 10. For most people, that sense of quantity develops naturally and makes numbers feel meaningful without any conscious thought. There's an interesting reason why this sense of quantity feels so fundamental. Researchers who study the evolutionary origins of numerical cognition argue that the ability to estimate quantities rapidly is ancient and that it exists across a remarkable range of species. The cognitive neuroscientist Stanisla Dina has written that this ability evolved because we live in a world of discrete, countable things, and being able to gauge quantity quickly has clear survival advantages. For example, knowing at a glance whether there is enough food there that will last you, or which patch of ground has more food, or whether your group is outnumbered by a predator. These are the kinds of rapid numerical judgments that mattered long before maths existed. This approximate sense of number, researchers call it the approximate number system, appears to be innate, present in human infants, and shared across vertebrates from fish to primates. It is, in other words, part of our biological makeup. Now, for a child with dyscalculia, that processing is less secure. Numbers don't carry that automatic sense of meaning. The link between the symbol, that digit on a page, and the quantity it represents is harder to grasp and harder to hold on to. And because that foundation is less secure, everything built on top of it takes significantly more effort. I find it helps to think of it in this way. When you look at the word cat, you don't see 3 separate letters and consciously decode them. You just read the word. The meaning arrives automatically. For most people, small numbers work in a similar way. You see 7 and you just know what 7 means. But for a child with dyscalculia, that automatic step doesn't happen reliably. The number is there on the page, but the quantity it represents doesn't arrive with it in the same way. Every encounter with that number requires a conscious effort that most children aren't having to make. And this matters most, not in isolation, but when numbers have to be used. So if we think of the example of cat, you are reading it in a sentence. You're having to make sense of the context that it's in. You're considering the way that it should be read aloud and so on. You're rarely just looking at that word cat. In the same way, you're rarely just looking at a number. You're doing something with it, comparing it, placing it, operating on it. When the foundation is uncertain, all of that becomes considerably harder. In practice, what this looks like for a child with dyscalculia can show up across a range of specific areas, and it's worth noting some of them because you may recognize your child in one or more of these. One is naming and ordering numbers. Knowing what a number is called or being able to place numbers in the right sequence can be unreliable and require conscious effort in a way that most children don't experience. Comparing quantities is often genuinely difficult, particularly as numbers get larger or less familiar, for example, when they become fractions or decimals. Deciding which of 2 numbers is greater and whether one amount is more or less than another isn't automatic. It has to be worked out. Another is estimation. Having a rough sense of whether an answer that has been calculated feels about right is frequently avoided because it's a difficult thing to process. An example of this is a child I assessed who told me that the answer to 36 plus 27 was 513. She'd followed a process which didn't quite work, and she had no sense of whether her answer was reasonable or wildly off. This is an example that rests directly on the sense of magnitude I've been talking about. Place value is frequently an area of difficulty too. It's understanding that the position of a digit changes its value. So, for example, the 4 in 47 means something very different to the 4 in 400. Counting itself, particularly counting on from a number other than 1 or counting backwards, can be much harder than it appears from the outside. None of these difficulties are about not trying. They reflect the fact that the underlying sense of quality, that's the foundation that all these skills rest upon, isn't operating in the automatic, reliable way it does for most children. The SASC guidance also identifies difficulties with math-specific language as a core feature of dyscalculia, and this is something I see regularly in my assessments. Maths has its own vocabulary, its own symbols, and its own way of using words that mean something different in everyday life. I remember teaching a child whose work was laid out quite messily on the page. I asked him to draw a table to organize his findings. He agreed and returned a short time later to show me his book. He'd drawn a fabulous table, neatly, used a ruler. Great job, you'd think. Except he'd drawn a dining room table around his work. Now, he wasn't being cheeky. He simply didn't have the math-specific meaning of that word to hand. And I've had a similar experience assessing a child who used the word difference perfectly well in everyday conversation. When she was asked what the difference was between two pictures, she had no difficulty at all. But when I asked her what the difference was between 9 and 4, she looked at the numbers carefully and said, well, the 9 has a curve at the top and the 4 is open. Now, she wasn't being humorous. She was answering the question that she understood. The mathematical meaning of difference simply hadn't connected in the way that the everyday meaning had. Now, these aren't isolated examples. Take terms like odd, volume, degree, face, share, edge, takeaway, digits, times. I could go on and on. For children with dyscalculia, the specialist language of maths, the words, the symbols, the conventions, requires conscious effort to interpret in a way that most children don't experience. And when you're already working hard to make sense of the numbers themselves, that additional layer of language demands even more of them. So what does any of this mean for you, practically, as a parent? Whether your child has dyscalculia specifically, or a broader specific learning difficulty in maths, or whether you're still trying to work out what's going on, a label or the absence of one doesn't change what I'm about to suggest. The most useful thing you can do right now is to start looking more carefully at what you're actually seeing. Think back over the last few weeks. When does maths feel hardest for your child? Is it the numbers themselves that seem to cause confusion? For example, the comparing of them, estimating them, understanding what they actually represent? Or is it more about following steps, remembering a sequence, understanding what a question is asking? Is it that they can do something one day and it seems to have gone the next? Is it that they freeze under any kind of pressure? Or that they understand something when you explain it slowly at home, but can't show that in school? Now, don't be surprised if the answer is more than one of these, because for most children it is. These are the kinds of observations that actually matter, both for your own understanding, and if you ever find yourself speaking to someone at school or seeking an assessment, these conversations are the sorts of things that you'll need to have. An assessor working with your child will be looking at exactly these things. A parent who has already started to notice them and to think carefully about where the difficulty is actually centered is in a much stronger position. So my practical suggestion for this episode is this: start making notes. Not a formal document, not a report, just observations kept somewhere you can add to over time. When maths is hard, have a think about what specifically seems to be happening. And when it goes better, what's different about those moments? Over time, those notes build into a picture that's particularly useful. If you've been listening from the beginning of this series, you'll have already had some frameworks to help you notice. For example, in episode 1, we talked about the many reasons why maths can be hard, its abstract nature, the working memory demands, the hierarchical nature of maths. In episode 2, we looked at why maths facts don't stick and what that actually looks like for a child trying to work through a calculation. Those questions are worth revisiting now with your own child specifically in mind. I've put together a companion guide for this episode, a free PDF that you'll find linked in the show notes. It gives you a simple framework for gathering and organizing your observations so that what you're noticing doesn't stay as a vague worry or a label you're not sure what to do with, but instead becomes something specific and useful. If you speak to someone at school or you're looking for an assessment, going into those conversations with clear, concrete observations does make a real difference. In the next episode, I'm going to look at something that many families tell me is one of the most exhausting parts of having a child who struggles with maths: homework. Why is it so often that it becomes a battleground? What's actually happening in those moments? And what might help? Thank you for being here. If you found this episode helpful, please do share it with another parent who might need it. And if you'd like to make sure you don't miss future episodes, you can subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts or follow the Safety in Numbers YouTube channel. Until next time, thank you for listening.